Hello and welcome to this Historical Association webinar on mapping women's suffrage. My name is Mahima Chanrai and I will be the host for this afternoon's webinar. I just have a few quick technical notes before we get started. Please note that our presenter Tara Morton and myself are both working from home, so if you do experience any audio difficulties, we hope that you can understand the quality might not be the quality that you would expect if we were working from our office. Please note that all participants will have their audio and video turned off by default. This is to allow us to listen in to Tara's presentation without any disruption. You won't be able to see Tara at the moment, but she will appear on video for the question and answers at the end. If you do have any questions during today's webinar, please feel free to type these into the chat box as they come, and we will take them at the end. Alternatively, at the end when we take questions, you can use the raise hand feature to indicate that you would like to ask a question, at which point we will unmute you, allow you to ask a question, and then Tara will answer it. If you have any technical queries throughout the webinar, please do feel free to get in touch with me via the chat box. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today. Tara Morton is the project coordinator for the Mapping Women's Suffrage project from the University of Warwick, and she was also the research historian for the HA's Suffrage Resources Project and Database. Tara, thank you very much for presenting for us today. Welcome.
For that. Thank you, Mahima, for your introduction. Today, as you know, I've been asked to talk about the Mapping Women's Suffrage project, which has created an interactive online map for recovering, plotting, recording and sharing the everyday locations, lives and materials of as many ordinary votes for women campaigners as possible across the country at the height of the suffrage movement in 1911. Now, the suffrage map, which is set in its own website, is a work in progress as we're looking to create an unprecedented legacy of data about votes for women campaigners ready for the 2028 suffrage centenary, commemorating 100 years since women attained the vote on the same terms as men. Now, collaboration is really at the heart of the Mapping Women's Suffrage project. So we're working with organisations like Warwick University, of course, and the National Archives, but also and vitally with local museums and history groups, as well as with family researchers who want to share their findings, bringing as many people together as we can to build this unprecedented map. So the aim of the Mapping Women's Suffrage project is to enable everyone, the public, students, historians, to take a fresh look at the people, the places, the documents and diversities that made up the movement at multiple educational levels and in exciting new ways. Not least, of course, potentially finding a suffragette down your street. And you know, we think this is a fantastic resource for schools, for example, because the map's accessible, it's visual, it's interactive and layered, meaning, as we'll explore today, you can draw out simple or more complex data, and it really complements and builds upon, as we head towards 2028, the excellent work done for the 2018 centenary, not least, of course, by the Historical Association and its own Women's Suffrage Resources Project website, which I had the privilege of working on. So as I said, sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide, which isn't happening. Just bear with me for a minute. There we go, thank goodness. I do apologise for that, everyone. I think my PC decided to freeze on us there. So I'm sorry about that. As I was saying, there are multiple layers and aspects to our project map. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of suffrage histories as a sort of backdrop to the map, if you like, and then how the map works and how its interactive tools create a suffrage heat map for analysis. Then I'm going to look, of course, at why we've mapped the year 1911, and the major talking point here, of course, will be the 1911 census survey and the suffrage boycott. Now, I will be illuminating between these sections on the screen through case studies of individual suffrage campaigners as we go these topics and issues. But as we head towards the conclusion and questions, I'll also focus down on two individuals. And that's, as you can see, Alice Lee, because she's an example of a fresh suffrage discovery that we've made through collaborative work on the project. And then something topical, I think, to all of our current lives by highlighting the story of a frontline health worker, Ellen Pitfield. And then, of course, I'll conclude and we'll move on to those questions, hopefully without too many more technical difficulties. So quickly on the background to suffrage histories, I'm not going to spend too much time going over the history of the women's suffrage movement, which many of you, I'm sure, will already know was a long, protracted campaign. Suffice to say that women's struggle for the right to vote in parliamentary elections became a nationally organised movement in 1866, when a petition signed by about 1,500 women across the country was handed into Parliament by Liberal MP John Stuart Mill, demanding the government grant female suffrage. And I can tell you it was met there with much laughter and much derision. Now, you can find out more, of course, about the lives of these pioneering petitioning women from 1866 on the Historical Association's Suffrage Resources database, and there's case studies there too. And after all, it was these women who organised and signed this very first national petition that lay the foundations of the suffrage movement that was to come, and they're so vitally important to our later understandings of the dynamic of that early 20th century suffrage movement. So by the time we get then to the early 20th century, women's battle for the vote had been afoot for over 50 years and would continue until the vote was partially won in 1918 by some women over 30 under the Representation of the People Act, and finally on the same terms as men in 1928 with the Equal Franchise Act. Now, during those years, of course, different women's suffrage societies emerged, as did a shift in the way that some women campaigned for the vote. Now, most societies, including the largest, Mrs. Millicent Forsyth's National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, founded in 1897, continued to advocate long-standing peaceful methods of campaigning, traditionally used by suffragists to persuade the government to grant women the franchise, such as organising marches, petitions, and lobbying MPs. And of course, these peaceful methods remain the chief tools of suffrage campaigning for most of those 50 plus years, showing, I think, women's extraordinary diligence and patience. And of course, these methods of political persuasion were continued right throughout the campaign and by multiple societies. And of course, they are also tactics that we see most protest groups using today. However, understandably frustrated by a lack of progress, especially when you consider that in between all of this, more men had been enfranchised under two Reform Acts. One, I think, was 1867 and the second, 1884. Some turned to more radical and later violent tactics to try to force the government's hand. Most notably, of course, Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst's WSPU, whose members became known as suffragettes. Although there has been a shift, I would say, in recent years towards more nuanced approaches, it's fair to say that popular representations of the Votes for Women campaign still often focus on the more dramatic deeds of WSPU suffragettes and in London, including vandalism and raids on the Houses of Parliament, along with numerous arrests and imprisonments, the consequent destructive cycle of hunger strikes and forcible feedings, of course, that ensued. And that's not to mention, of course, the targeted bombing of empty properties, including some churches, and the martyrdom of Emily Wilding Davison. Now, these are all fascinating and dramatic stories and vital to the history of the movement. Yet most women campaigned for the vote in the communities where they lived around the country, whether they were suffragettes setting fire to local pillar boxes in the Warwickshire town of Leamington Spa, or more moderate suffragists organising afternoon teas to bring politically like-minded women together in Leeds. And it's the lives of these ordinary women and men, alongside those more renowned figures and leaders of the campaign, that are often still hidden from public view in family attics or buried in regional archives, that the Mapping Women's Suffrage Project seeks to recover, plot, record and share, accessed via the houses and communities where they lived in 1911 on Our Suffrage Map. So how does the map work and what does it do? Well, the location of each suffrage campaigner added to the map is pinpointed by a coloured icon or dot on the map. And the colour of the icon represents which suffrage society each belonged to. So in 1911, and so it was red for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. We've used purple for the WSPU, and so on. Now, by zooming right in and clicking on a campaigner icon in the street, hometown, or city where you live, a data box that you can see in the example slide here, containing a range of data about them, such as name, address, age, occupation, and a biography, as well as a range of digitized materials where they exist, such as photographs, letters, and official documents appear. Now, usually these documents are scattered across and between different physical and online locations, but they can be gathered together for each campaigner here on the map, centralized and displayed in an accessible way, as I said, around at the time they were living, where they were living in 1911, at the time or around the time of the government's population or census survey of 1911, which I'll come back to talk about shortly. Now, aside from the historical materials and images that you can sort of see an example of in the data box slide, we're also actively encouraging local people to send in new photographs of campaigner houses and streets where those still survive. And this is not least because one of our aims as the map becomes more populated is to encourage people to use it to create their own suffrage walks and to tell us about them. And of course, using our map on your mobile phone, together with the inclusion of more modern, recognisable photographs of surviving houses, is a really helpful way of navigating around, if you like, on the ground. Now, Edith Bevan, who I've used to illustrate the data box example on the slide here, represents a great example of what we want to achieve with the project map, and for several reasons. So first of all, I'll just say a little bit about Edith herself, who's seated in the centre of this photograph. And in 1911, she was 42 years old, single, and a member of Mrs. Fawcett's National Union. And her hat in this photograph, which obviously we sadly can't appreciate because it's black and white, is decorated with the National Union colours of red, green, and white. Now, she was living in 1911 at Horsegate House in Sussex, and her father was a director of Barclays Bank in Brighton, and one of her 4 brothers was actually the Camden Town Group artist Robert Bevan. Now, as a young woman, Edith began training as a nurse in London, but had to return home to look after her ailing mother and then to stay on as companion to her widowed father. And in April 1909, Edith held a meeting at Horsegate House, and it was actually there that she co-founded the Cuckfield Women's Suffrage Society. And the following year, in 1910, Edith and her father became vice presidents of the larger Horsham Suffrage Society, which sat under the umbrella of the National Union. Now, Edith was a local force to be reckoned with. And in 1913, she headed up the Central Sussex Suffragists, who you can see in this photograph here, in the Great Suffrage Pilgrimage, organised by the National Union, which saw women peacefully walk from all parts of the country to converge in London. And it's likely that, as the first overnight stop was actually to London was actually en route to Cuckfield, that the marches were most likely put up at Edith's home at Horsegate, which we have a black and white photograph of here. And as you can see, it's quite a magnificent building and actually reflects the status locally of the Bevan family. Oh, and by the way, I mean, if you'd like to read more specifically about the National Union Great Pilgrimage, I would highly recommend a fabulous book by Jane Robertson called Hearts and Minds. It really is worth a read. Now, in terms of the Mapping Women's Suffrage project, the biographical information that we've gathered about Edith Bevan was compiled and sent to us by an independent suffrage researcher and writer called Frances Stenlake. And in turn, most of these fabulous photographs that you see now, including this one of Horsegate House, was contributed to us by the local Cuckfield Museum. In addition, the wonderful Sue Burgess, who I'd like to thank as curator there, also popped out for a much needed walk with her dog during lockdown and took this fabulous modern blue-skied photograph of Horsegate House, which thankfully still exists. And this now sits comfortably alongside the old one on our map. So I think Edith Bennet's case demonstrates how our mapping project, and how the map in particular, can act as a focal point to bring people together and to bring resources together so that everyone can see and find them in one easily accessible place on our map. And I think what's also worth noting, and I think this is a really great feature, hopefully you will too, is that part of the interactive map features also means that we've included an old map. So you can look at a campaigner like Edith's home on a current street map, or on a historical 1888 to 1913 ordnance survey map. And I've just put this slide together quickly to illustrate and to show you how, if you haven't been on the site already, you can choose or flick between them. And all you have to do is hover over and click the map overlay box at the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And I think this is a fascinating function in itself for showing how much actually the built environment has changed since then. And also by having sort of access to this past landscape, we can reflect upon how the landscape at that time might have interacted with suffrage campaigners' ability to campaign and to form, for instance, local societies, depending on things like the density of towns and the density of areas around them. Also, for those of you that might be interested in a broader take on the geographies of the suffrage movement, as the map becomes more populated, the coloured icons for each campaigner on the map, so red, as we said, for National Union campaigners like Edith Bennett, purple for WSPU, and so on, will collectively create a sort of unique suffrage heat map. Now, admittedly at the moment, we have to imagine for now a much denser riot of colour than this, as you can imagine, as we head toward 2028 and the map becomes more populated. I like to think of it much like John Snow's general election map, if any of you remember that. And so the map at that point will really visually illustrate in one snapshot the geographies of different suffrage society support across the country in 1911. And this will reveal and encourage fresh studies and interpretations of the shapes and patterns of suffrage society support in different towns and regions, and even in different streets, allowing that sort of micro or macro comparison between different suffrage society support across the country. Now, interestingly, just on this slide as an example, we have the East Midlands as it currently stands on the map. And we can already see that the law-abiding National Union is looking better represented in the urban city of Coventry than the WSPU at this stage. And as we move geographically down from Coventry through more rural and semi-rural areas like Kenilworth and into the town of Leamington Spa, we see a different suffrage society entirely beginning to dominate. And that's the Conservative and Unionist Women's Franchise Association in the blue there. And this was a Conservative Party with a capital C affiliated group, which, like the National Union, was committed to peaceful methods. And I think this is how the map will allow us to better explore why such differences might exist. Now, of course, also, if you're interested in studying a particular suffrage society, whether that be the WSPU or the National Union, then it's great to be able to drill that data down, if you like, further. So we've added interactive tools to the map so that the campaigner icons displayed can be filtered by suffrage society. So as this slide illustrates, you can select or deselect suffrage campaigner icons on the map by suffrage society by ticking or unticking the boxes on the side menu on the map. And this fades out, if you like, other society icons, leaving only, in the case of this slide example, National Union campaigner icons on display. But of course, you can choose any society or any combination of societies. And again, this increases the range and way that this type of accumulated data can be explained and interpreted via the map. So I think next of all, I really need to talk about why our suffrage map is set in 1911. Now, firstly, by 1911, the suffrage campaign was, of course, flourishing with lots of suffrage societies and membership numbers mushrooming. But it was also the year, of course, that the government undertook its decennial census survey, gathering population statistics from every household in the country. The census survey taken by them for over half a century is invaluable to historians in providing snapshots into people's lives across the country, as well, of course, as twinning those details of those people's lives with their physical locations. That said, for those historians focusing on women, there have always been issues with the government census survey in terms of the level of data recorded. Historically, census forms were filled in by government officials, with information solicited from heads of household, which generally meant husbands or fathers. Therefore, without their own voice, the recording of women's details, even their full names, never mind ages or occupations, were often scantily noted. I can't count the number of times that I've come across women whose lives have simply been reduced to Mrs. Smith. And in fact, I do briefly address some of the issues surrounding this in a short essay written during my work for the Historical Association Suffrage Resources Projects, entitled Constructing the Database, Creation, Inspiration and Compromise in Suffrage Research, which I believe you can still read on the website. Now, the amount of information the 1911 census survey requested from individual householders was more detailed than ever before to inform the government's ambitious health and welfare reform scheme. So apart from the obvious point that it was taken at the height of the suffrage movement, the chief reasons why our mapping project is set in 1911 is firstly, because the 1911 census allows us to trace the vast majority of suffrage campaigner home addresses for the map, which of course is vital to the project, but also because the level of data it contains, including age, marital status and occupation, but also number of years married, children born versus children surviving, as well as numbers and types of rooms in any household. This kind of information in the 1911 census survey is a really rich resource for suffrage historians because it allows us to identify not just the whereabouts of suffrage campaigners, but also to gain really significant glimpses into their everyday homes, their standard of living and life events. Now, historians of the suffrage movement currently agree that most suffrage campaigners complied with the 1911 census, but there were, of course, those that did not, which makes it both a problematic suffrage resource and yet also an absolutely fascinating one. And this is because, in protest at the government's refusal to grant women the vote, some suffrage campaigners who were willing to engage in an act of civil disobedience boycotted the census. The boycott was originally organised by the Women's Freedom League, a breakaway group from the WSPU, formed by some of its former members in 1907. But the boycott was swiftly adopted thereafter by the WSPU leadership. The thrust of the census boycott, if you will, was the argument that if women don't count, which rendered voteless by the government they didn't, then why should they in turn be counted? And there's an excellent article by suffrage experts Elizabeth Crawford and Jill Liddington on the Mapping Women's Suffrage website resources page that says more about this, along with other text and podcasts about the boycotts. But women who took part in the suffrage boycott did so in two key ways, either evading the census altogether or by resisting it. And the Mapping Women's Suffrage project records, as part of its data gathering process for the map, what stance each campaigner took in the boycott, and I'll come back to this shortly. So those who evaded the census deliberately absented themselves from their usual home address on census night, so they could not be counted, making it more difficult, of course, for us to trace them for our suffrage map. And evasions often involved organising or taking part in mass suffrage sleepovers elsewhere, as this slide demonstrates. And this photograph is actually of one such census sleepover in Denison House in Manchester that became known as Census Lodge because just over 200 evaders took part, and there were also some men included in that. Now, many of these evasions went undetected by census officials, as was, of course, the intention, meaning that those participating are officially invisible and absent from the census record. But especially with larger gatherings, evasions didn't always go to plan. And a great example of this is an evasion organised in Gillingham by WSPU suffragette Laura Ainsworth. Born in 1885 in Northumberland, Laura became a teacher but gave up her position to work as an organiser for the WSPU, first in London and then in Birmingham. She was arrested in Birmingham in 1909 for disrupting a meeting with other suffragettes being held by the Prime Minister at Bingley Hall. She was imprisoned in Winson Green, and Laura immediately went on hunger strike where, unfortunately, she was forcibly fed. Once released, she was taken to a nursing home to recover from what was a really brutal practice. Now, like many WSP organisers, Laura's life was peripatetic over the next few years. She worked in Bradford, Bolton, back in London, in Southend, Maidstone, and during 1911 in Gillingham. Laura had regular lodgings in Gillingham at what is now 32 Stewart Road, and this is where she's located on our map. But on census night, she was absent. As a committed suffragette, she was busy overseeing a census evasion of other suffragettes at Jezreel Hall in Gillingham's Canterbury Street. As this slide shows, the census form for Laura's organised evasion was tracked down only very recently, by the way, by suffrage expert Elizabeth Crawford with great difficulty. But in the top left-hand corner there of the census form, the census official has noted that the evasion at the hall, which was then a dance academy, was, and I quote, "a party of suffragettes assembled, consisting of 1 male and 39 female." So this was a considerably sized evasion. But the question is how the census official was able to record them. How did he know that they were there? The locations of these events were generally shrouded in secrecy, kept among organisers and participants. Well, apparently the over-exuberant suffragettes inside were making so much noise, laughing and chattering, that complaints had been made, the police were called to investigate, and in turn, of course, they tipped off the census official who recorded the event. So by having such a good time, the suffragettes undid their own plans to some degree by attracting unwanted attention. But I have to say that's a party that I would have loved to have been at. Now, on the other hand, women who chose to resist rather than evade the census tended to stay at their homes or regular lodgings on census night, but stalwartly refused to give the required details. And some, of course, even graffitied defiant votes for women's slogans across their census forms. And a great example of this is Mary Howie, a WSPU member living at Holly Lodge in Cradley in northern Worcestershire in 1911, who made, as you can see, her protest quite clear for all to see on her census form. But we only have these wonderful handwritten forms held at the National Archives in Kew, because for the first time in 1911, the census was filled in by the head of a household's own hand rather than by government officials. And these handwritten forms from 1911, completed like Mary's in the very households we're putting them back into on the map, give fascinating glimpses into the mindsets of suffrage campaigners at this time, particularly where some graffitied more complex messages. And an example of this on this next slide is from Marion Coates Hanson, who in 1911 lived in Roman Road in the northern town of Middlesbrough. Now, she took part in the census boycott as a resister and as a member of the Women's Freedom League, as did her sister-in-law, fellow WFL member and near neighbour in Roman Road, Alice Schofield Coates, and the two are on our map. Marion's German-born husband, Frederick, who was supportive of her politics, writes for her on the census form, and I quote, "The females in this house refuse to supply any information whatever until they are granted the rights and privileges of citizenship. No vote, no census of women." And the females in the house included Marion and 2 unnamed servants. Now, like many women involved in suffrage campaigning, Marion and her sister-in-law Alice, who incidentally were both school teachers, a common occupation amongst Women's Freedom League members, would go on to be influential in Middlesbrough politics for many years, Marion becoming Middlesbrough's second female councillor, with her sister-in-law Alice being the first in 1919. Now, it's said that although they worked very closely together during the suffrage campaign, the sister-in-laws disliked each other intensely. So we see in their successive councillorships in Middlesbrough a great political dedication to improving the local lives of people in the town, but perhaps with a spoonful of healthy rivalry thrown in too. Now, there are also examples of battles between those for and against women's suffrage on the census form themselves. And I think this is an especially great example. Research for the mapping project in Warwickshire in the town of Leamington revealed the census form for Ada FlorenceWhittick, a law-abiding member of the Conservative and Unionist Women's Franchise Association that I mentioned earlier, who were prominent in the area. And as one would expect as law-abiding, Ada complied with the census in that she gave her details. And yet, under her signed name at the bottom right of the census form, she has written non-militant suffragist, and then in brackets, at present. And this is a clear indication to me of campaigners' growing frustration by 1911, that even Ada, as a law-abiding suffragist in Leamington, is clearly on the cusp of crossing that line into militancy, and she's certainly thinking about it. Now, interestingly, you'll also know that she's written the Votes for Women slogan in every margin of the form. But if I could just draw your attention to the top margin, you should, I hope, be able to see that the word no has been inserted just in front of the Votes for Women slogan in pencil. Now, we surmise that this was the census official, clearly not sympathetic to the suffrage cause, making his own counter-protest afterwards by trying to negate Ada's statement. Now, just to make clear, these wonderful census forms for campaigners are on our map, courtesy of the brilliant National Archives, and I'd like to thank Vicky Glukowski in particular for her work on this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we record each campaigner's stance on the census boycott as part of the Mapping Women's Suffrage data entry process, so whether they complied, evaded or resisted. Therefore, as with which suffrage society they supported, we've created tooling on the map to filter this data for those interested in analysing broader patterns of the census protest. So, as you can see, hopefully from the illustrative slide, you can select or deselect campaigner icons on the map by their various census responses, whether they complied, evaded or resisted, using the side menu on the map. And again, this fades out other icons, revealing separate geographic patterns of those campaigners that did or didn't participate, or whether they resisted or evaded. Now, combined with the colour coding of icons by a suffrage society on the map, this also reveals the most popular method of boycotting amongst different suffrage society members, as well, of course, as highlighting or flagging up any anomalies, like, for example, unexpected National Union resistors or invaders, for example. Now, academic research so far, chiefly by experts Elizabeth Crawford and Jill Liddington, indicates that most women involved with the suffrage campaign complied with rather than boycotted the census survey. But as more women are inevitably recovered and recorded for our suffrage map as we head towards 2028, we wish to build on their research and analysis and to see what the map reveals, adding to existing knowledge and interpretations of the suffrage census boycott. So, as we begin to move towards the conclusion of the presentation, I'd like to share with you just a couple of suffrage stories in addition to those sort of already touched upon from our suffrage map so far, that I think really typify the project aims of recovering currently hidden suffrage campaigners through collaborative work, as well as ending with something topical, given the extraordinary situation that we've all found ourselves in due to the coronavirus pandemic, by focusing on the extraordinarily brave people that have always been on our front line as health workers. So first, we have the story, or the suffrage story of Alice Lee, a completely new discovery of an ordinary yet extraordinary woman that emerged from our project work in the city of Coventry, which has since intersected with family research via our suffrage map. And secondly, Nurse Ellen Pitfield in London, a known suffrage campaigner, but one whose seldom told story we can tell now more fully through the map, having pulled together original materials and images from supporting organisations. So, Alice Lee was born in Leicestershire, but by 1911 was living with her sister's family at 46 Shaftesbury Avenue in Coventry and was employed as a letting agent. Alice, we discovered, was likely actually responsible for getting the Coventry branch of the WSPU started sometime in the late spring of 1908. And so central was she that she served as both secretary and president in those early days. Now, that year of 1908, Alice was the only woman representing Coventry in a deputation of WSPU women who travelled to London to see the Prime Minister and put the Votes for Women case to him. Now, the Prime Minister refused to speak with them, and so the women reassembled at nearby Caxton Hall, where it was decided they would return to Parliament Square to protest at this refusal. There, the women were prevented by police and scuffles broke out, leading to Alice's arrest for obstruction. Now, nearly 30 women were arrested along with Alice that day, and like them, Alice was offered the choice of a fine of £25 or 1 month's imprisonment. Alice decided it would be better to serve the cause by going to prison, and so she went to Holloway. She was released 1 month later on the 31st of July, along with 15 other suffragettes. Now, the women were met upon their release at the gate by crowds of well-wishers, including WSPU leaders Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, with bouquets of flowers and a brass band, before being whisked by a wagonette to a celebratory breakfast. And the photograph on the left of the slide actually shows what this event would have looked like. This is a celebratory breakfast similarly held later in the year, not long after Alice's release actually, for more suffragettes who had been leaving Holloway, and it looks a fabulous event. Incidentally, the clipping on the right shows that Alice was undeterred because as a few months later in October, she was drenched from above, as the clipping tells us, while she was chalking Votes for Women messages on the street below. She carried on nonetheless, this time moving up to chalk them on the portico-covered steps instead, where she couldn't get drenched, although there is no evidence to suggest that she was ever arrested again. Now, upon returning from prison to Coventry, Alice was invited to speak about her experiences to local Votes for Women supporters at St Peter's Vicarage by Reverend Percy Widrington. He was a socialist and supportive of the WSPU, so much so actually that he ended up marrying Miss Dawson, who's mentioned there in the pavement chalking article alongside Alice, under the local, typically sensationalist and exclamated headline, "Socialist Vicar weds suffragette," so some things never change. Now, at the vicarage meeting, Alice said she did not regret her month in Holloway. She went to prison because it seemed to her the only way, or at any rate, the best way, in which she could help the movement. Now, in 1909, she seems to have left Coventry's WSPU, who gifted Alice an enamel pendant as a token of their high regard and affection, and for the suffering she'd endured in prison. Alice's reason for leaving is not clear, but she thanked them for the gift and assured them, and I quote, that the hardest thing to do for the cause was to do nothing. But there's a follow-on chapter to Alice's story. After we put Alice on the Mapping Women's Suffrage map, we were contacted by a family member who saw it. Subsequently, and only recently, he has sent through to us some additional information and materials about her. So recently, in fact, that we haven't yet added them to the map, although we will do shortly. So you were actually the first to see them today. And these were a letter that was sent to her in Holloway the day after her imprisonment by her brother-in-law, who wrote, "It's refreshing to find anyone so in love with the ideal as to go to prison for it. Your cause will win, and you will have had the satisfaction of suffering for it." The letter was returned, likely by the Deputy Governor of Holloway, as was a later family letter informing them that Alice was not entitled to receive letters or visits, but that she had, and I quote, "been given your message about bail. She declines to be released and wishes you not to worry about her." Moreover, the enamelled pendant I mentioned, given to her upon leaving the Coventry WSPU, I'm thrilled to say is still in the family's possession. And the slide shows a picture of it. And as you can see, it's a prison gate with a tri-enamelled panels in the centre, made up of WSPU colours of purple, white and green. And this is what we really want from the project and what we get excited about sharing with everyone. And we now have, I'm again thrilled to say, a growing number of similar family contributions waiting in the wings to be added to the map. So now I'm going to finish with Ellen Pitfield's story. Now, Ellen was a trained nurse and midwife and probably joined the WSPU in 1908. She became a fully fledged WSPU suffragette, and as you can see from the slide here, she was listed as arrested 5 times, as you can see on the slide from the Home Office, during the women's suffrage campaign. Twice in 1909, twice in 1910 as part of the infamous Black Friday, where the police meted out violence on protesting suffragettes, and once more in 1912. In the course of her arrests and imprisonments, Ellen went on hunger strike, receiving a medal from the WSPU in recognition. Now, in 1911, aged 43, and on our map when the census survey was taken, Ellen was working and residing at the new Hospital for Women, Euston Road in London, and you can see some of the exterior photographs here and also interior photographs too. And what's really interesting and special about the hospital, of course, is that it was originally founded by Britain's first female doctor and, of course, suffrage campaigner herself, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Now, Ellen appears on the 1911 census at the hospital, but as a resister, refusing to give her information. And you can see here on the slide that the census official has written in "suffragette refused information." Now, subsequently and sadly, Ellen discovered that she had cancer and that she would not recover. And it's at that moment, I think, we get a sense of her commitment to the suffragette cause by what she did next. A demonstration was organised by the WSPU on the 4th of March 1912, in support of which Ellen wrote to WSPU leader Emmeline Pankhurst, declaring herself, as you can see from this transcript on the slide, a soldier to the death. She then set fire to a basket of wood shavings at the General Post Office, also breaking a window there, and gave herself up to police to raise publicity for the cause. That month, Ellen was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment, but was so weak by then, she was carried straight from court to the prison hospital. Prison authorities were aware of her condition, so they asked Ellen to swear an undertaking that she would not engage in any further militant action so that they could consider her early release. Ellen, unbelievably courageously, refused to agree, but prison officials noted that she said, and I quote, she doubted if it was in her to offend again. Now, a petition ensued for Ellen's release, which likely happened a couple of months later in May that year, we think, although we can't be certain of the exact date. And she was cared for upon her release from prison by WSP nurse Catherine Pine and Gertrude Townsend at their nursing home at 9 Pembridge Gardens, Notting Hill. And you can see a photograph of Pembridge Garden nursing home on the slide there. And this was likely taken a couple of years later in 1914. And both nurses and the property actually appear on our map. And you can see, of course, Nurse Pine here standing up in the photograph to the right, taking care of WSPU leader Emmeline Pankhurst, which she did for many, many years. Now, under the care of her fellow nurses and suffrage companions, Nurse Ellen Pitfield lived for a few more months, but sadly died at Pembridge Gardens in August 1912, aged just 44 years old. And it's as many of those lives and stories of women's grit and patience as we've seen, of perseverance or self-sacrifice across the country, that the Mapping Women's Suffrage Project really aims to capture, not least in this case, in Ellen Pitfield's case, by showing how we can draw everything together and make it easily accessible to everyone on our map. So, in conclusion, and thank you so much for bearing with me with those technical difficulties at the beginning, I hope that I've given you a good overview of the Mapping Women's Suffrage Project, its aims and intentions, its interactive map tools and functions, and so, of course, the different ways and levels in which you can use the varied data moving forward and materials it contains, particularly, obviously, as the map becomes more populated as we head towards that suffrage centenary in 2028. For those of you interested, of course, in simply reading about and seeing who was in your hometown or region, or if there was a suffragette down your street, you can click on an icon on the map to pull up that suffrage campaigner data box at their home address with stories and images. For those Interest in broader patterns, geographies and interpretations, whether of suffrage society support across the country, a town or region, or the shape and type of census protests. You can use those interactive tools to explore this recorded data differently. And of course, you can explore it on an old or on a new map. There's also additional supporting resources and blogs on the project website about the mapping work and suffrage stories. But most of all, I want to stress that Mapping Women's Suffrage is a collaborative project, because only by bringing people together with contributions, images and materials from the National Archives, but also from local archives like Cuckfield Museum and from family researchers like those of Alice Lee, can we really start to tell these rich and often still hidden suffrage stories across the country. So please do visit our website, and if you can help with the project and get involved in any way, please do. You'll see there are so many different ways that you can do so. And I'd just like to end, of course, by thanking the Historical Association so much for allowing me to do this presentation, and for yourselves for taking the time to hear about the project. And again, I do apologise for those technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tara Morton, for an incredibly interesting talk and presentation. We look forward to finding out more about the project as the years go on. We now have some time for questions. So if you do have a question, please feel free to type that into the chat box, or you can use the raise hand feature and ask your question out loud. A reminder in the meantime that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the webinar recording via email in the next 24 hours. And we'd also be very grateful, along with that email, for your feedback. We'll include a link to a quick feedback survey. Tara, if anyone has any questions who's listening to the recording, there is that Twitter handle that you've shown on the website, and there's a website link. Are there any other ways that people can contact you?
Yes, there is a contact page on the website, and you can contact us via that. If, for example, you were already ready to submit a suffrage campaigner, because of course we accept not just new ones, but also ones that we need to put on the map that may be available in published sources already. There's a submission form that you can use there. We are launching an Instagram account soon as well, so that's another way that you'll be able to access what we're doing. But yeah, I mean, on the website, if you'd like to visit, there is a contact us page, and that's probably the easiest way to get in touch with us, and we can get back to you then as soon as possible.
Lovely, thank you. Not a question, but a thank you from a participant who's looking forward to exploring the site further in the chat.
Thank you, I'm very appreciative of that.
Simi. It doesn't look like we have any further questions at the moment. But, okay, we have a question from Amy, which is, does the website offer any ways that the public could get involved? You sort of answered that, but if you wanted to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy, 100%. There is actually a Get Involved page on the project website. And if you read through that and scroll down, it suggests a variety of ways that you can get involved. As I said, I mean, the map is so huge that, you know, the more volunteers we have, the more contributions we have from members of the public, from local history groups, from family researchers. I mean, potentially this is even something that school projects could work on. You know, there are lots of suffrage campaigners that need to go on the map that schools could work on together as a project and even submit them to us. There are so many different ways you could get involved. I mean, as I mentioned with the case of Edith Bevan, simply, for example, if near to your home or school or wherever you're situated, there's someone on the map whose potential home is still surviving. If you're a keen photographer, go out there, take a photograph of it, send it to us, we can include it on the map. But I would urge Amy and anyone else who wants to participate in the project to look at the website and go to the Get Involved page. which, as I say, does make lots of suggestions about ways you can get involved. And again, you know, contact us, contact the project if you have any questions or queries about that, and we can get back to you and help you with any questions you might have.
Thank you, Tara. We have another question from Sarah, who's asked whether the project has been focused on specific areas to begin with, mentioning that the Southwest is looking sparser than you might expect at the moment.
Well, of course, this is a very long-term project, looking towards completion in 2028. So we are quite, I guess you would say, in the early stages of progress. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we've very much, I guess, in these early stages, focused on the Warwickshire area, for example, because that's where we piloted the map to begin with, to test out some of the map tools, for example, to test out the responses from local communities. Hence, you can see there's slightly more denser populations around that sort of Coventry, sort of Leamington areas. Other bits that are populated so far actually have mostly been sent in by public contributions, which is absolutely fantastic and really what we're looking for. We've obviously, you know, sort of building up momentum, if you like. So as time moves forward, obviously we will be populating the map more swiftly and we will be picking up the pace. So all of these areas will gradually and certainly in flurries become more populated. And actually waiting in the wings at the moment, we've got several contributions that will populate significantly certain areas and from contributions sent in by local historians, for example, and research groups. So I think it's just a question of patience. I mean, I do understand it's frustrating not to see your area on the map more populated at the moment. But as I say, this is a long-term project towards 2028, and that will happen. And if anyone is kind of looking at their area thinking, well, why isn't so-and-so on there? Why isn't so-and-so on there? I would suggest, please contact us. Be the one that submits that campaign to the map. We'd love to hear from you. You know, and all the contributions that we can get are welcome. And of course, anyone who does make a contribution also gets credited for that on the map. We aim to be an ethical and inclusive project. So anyone that sends anything in is fully recognised for that and for their contribution. So yeah, we will be picking up pace and things will move forward now as the project pilots have finished and we move forward. So I look forward to having some populations appearing for suffrage campaigners in the Southwest very soon.
Thank you, Tara. And I think that answers Laura's follow-up question asking about Reading. So Laura, we hope that you can contribute some suffrage campaigners in your area.
Please do, Laura. That would be a fantastic contribution.
We have another question from Adele, who asks, do you find that certain classes of women were more likely to evade the census?
That's a really good question. I think there are lots of factors that affected women's decision to evade the census or not to evade the census, or how, whether to evade or to resist. I think where class likely played an issue was in the fact that this was actually, I guess, what you would call an illegal activity. It was, as I said in the presentation, an act of civil disobedience. Not complying with the census, whether that was as a resistor or as an evader, solicited quite a substantial fine, potentially, and also potentially imprisonment. So for working class women whose, you know, income was, you know, negligible anyway, risking a fine was a huge undertaking. Risking imprisonment for the same reason was a huge undertaking. So it was a huge decision for them to make. So I think in that sense, working class women were much more unlikely to take part for those reasons. Middle class women with independent funds, for example, could perhaps be more prepared to take that risk. And so I think generally speaking, the reflection would be that working class women tended not to take it up as often. But again, there are so many different factors that influence this that we can't really put it down to one thing or another thing. But certainly I do think that those fines and that potential imprisonment, which thankfully didn't happen in the end, the government decided not to pursue women who had evaded and resisted, thankfully. But at that time when the census protest was going on, of course, women didn't know that. And so it would have been and was a huge risk for them to take in particular.
Thank you, Tara. That looks like all of the questions that we have for today. So in the meantime, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of you for taking part, those of you who contributed questions, and in particular to Tara Morton for sharing your time and expertise with us and continuing to do so over the next few years as part of the project.
Thank you so much.
We will be sharing a recording with you, and please keep an eye out for more webinars from the Historical Association on our website, history.org.uk. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.